Chapter 10, Respiratory System, Screencast 3. Now, this screencast is focusing primarily on gas exchange and a couple of new terms that you have to remember here. Now, partial pressure, you want to remember that the air that we breathe is a mix of nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. And based on how much of that gas is in the mixture, it exerts a particular pressure. So that's how we're going to measure gas concentration, using partial pressure. And as noted, the partial pressure of a gas is proportional to its percentage of the total gas composition. Now, the other thing that's important here is I want you to think of a partial pressure gradient just like a concentration gradient. So a gas will always diffuse or move down its partial pressure gradient from an area of high partial pressure to an area of lower partial pressure. So once again, this is how gas is going to move and how we're actually exchanging it, either into the blood, out of the blood, into the cells, out of the cells. So keep that in mind. Now, don't get caught up with these numbers because that's not really what I want you to do here. But we're really looking at exchange. So here we see oxygen diffusing from the alveoli into the blood. It's going to go down its partial gradient. And CO2 is moving from blood into the alveoli down its partial pressure gradient. So once again, this is external gas exchange here. Now, when we look at internal, now it's a little different. Oxygen is moving down its pressure gradient from capillaries to interstitial fluid and into the cells and tissues. CO2 diffuses down its pressure gradient from cells through the interstitial fluid into the blood capillaries. The oxygen and CO2 each flow down their own pressure gradient in opposite directions. So one of the things I want you to remember, be comfortable with what gas and what direction it's moving in. Oxygen is going to be moving into the blood or into the tissues. Carbon dioxide is going to be moving into the blood or into the alveolus within the lungs. And you know it's going from high pressure to low pressure. So that's a really, really important thing for you to remember. And if you understand that, you pretty much have this where you need to. Now here we can actually see, once again, the ventilation. Okay, and notice far more oxygen, okay, we're going to find in the air that we breathe than CO2, okay? And here, once again, we're expressing this in millimeters of mercury, okay? And so here, we're basically looking at what's going in, okay? So the oxygen, okay, is going to move into the alveolus, okay? Here's our external respiration. Okay, and then when we're at the tissue level here, we can actually see internal respiration. So once again, oxygen is going to move into the cell, CO2 is moving out. And so once again, what's being combined here basically is the movement of the air through the entire circulatory system. So here we're combining parts of cardiovascular with the respiratory system overall. Now, when we look at how oxygen is transported, it's primarily bound to the protein hemoglobin. And remember, when we talked about red blood cells, sometimes I'll describe them as a bag of hemoglobin. So that accounts for the majority of oxygen transport. There is a very slight amount, about 2%, that's actually dissolved in plasma. Now here we can once again see what's going on, a little bit dissolved in plasma, but oxygen primarily transported by hemoglobin, and here we see oxyhemoglobin, so the two have actually combined. And remember, that accounts for about 98% of all oxygen transport. Now CO2 is a little bit more difficult. It can be dissolved because it has a greater solubility coefficient than oxygen does. So you're going to find about 10% of total CO2 dissolved in plasma. About 20% of CO2 can actually bind to hemoglobin. It will bind to the non-iron part of the hemoglobin molecule for transport. And then the majority of it, or 70%, is converted into bicarbonate, and that's how it's going to be transported. And that actually plays a very important role because bicarbonate ion acts as a very potent blood buffer. Now here we can kind of see what's going on. Okay, so a little bit, that 10% dissolved in plasma. We'll see some, okay, 20% actually bound to the hemoglobin molecule. But notice what happens here. This accounts for 70%, and the conversion occurs within the red blood cells. So CO2 in the presence of water, and this enzyme here is carbonic anhydrase. So that's the enzyme. And what we find here is carbonic acid. And that's a weak acid that dissociates into hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion. And it's the bicarbonate ion that basically diffuses into the plasma and accounts for the majority of all CO2 transport.